Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. The Russian camera industry produced many rangefinder cameras and lenses from the early 30s to the mid-90s. Most of them were either copies of or inspired by lenses made by German manufacturers. They were cheap when new and they're still cheap today. And they all make great images on digital mirrorless cameras. Today we're going to look at 5 Russian rangefinder lenses that you can use on a mirrorless camera today. They range in price from about £15 to about £60 or so they're very affordable. They all make great images and they all have a signature look. Old lenses from the film days tend to have character, and these are no exception. They'll give you a look that has personality, rather than the perfect and rather clinical look of modern lenses. They're all well made, and they've all stood the test of time, and they're all great fun to use. We're going to start with the VIII 50mm f3.5 collapsible. It was made from the early 30s to, I think, the early 50s. And there were coated and uncoated versions. This is the uncoated version and it dates from the mid-30s as far as I can tell. As I understand it, this lens is a direct copy of the Leica Elmar 50mm f3.5. It was supplied with early versions of the VIII camera, and that was an exact reverse-engineered copy of the Leica II. Now, if the Leica camera was copied, I think it's a pretty good bet that the lens was too. And this lens does make similar images to its German predecessor. I like this lens a lot. In some ways it's very low tech. It's not particularly fast at f3.5 and it's not particularly sharp either. It loses contrast very quickly if you're shooting into the light, and it's much better if you keep the light behind you. A strength of this lens is the way it renders colour. I think it does it really well, and it compares well to much more expensive lenses in this respect. It makes very nice black and white images too. Black and white shots from this lens remind me of old 30s movies. Low contrast, a little bit soft, with a good range of tones. It's a collapsible lens, but be really careful before you collapse it on the mirrorless body. You could damage a sensor and ruin your camera. It does collapse on my Sony A7, but perhaps the safest way is not to collapse it at all. The aperture runs from f3.5 to f18, and it's very fiddly to change. I tend to leave it fully open, but then again, I do shoot most lenses wide open anyway. It's a rangefinder lens, so minimum focus distance is 3 feet, maybe a bit more if you stop the aperture down. And while this might seem like a handicap, I find I very quickly get used to it. And if you're going for an old school look, this lens will give it to you in abundance without any need for tweaks in post-production. It's got a handy focusing tab with an infinity lock, but this one fouls the adapter and it won't lock. But there are different designs, and some later ones will lock. If yours won't, you can grind a little bit of metal out of the adapter with a Dremel or something. I haven't done that, as this one focuses to infinity just before it reaches the lock, so all's well. There's not too much in the way of background blur with this one. But what there is nice enough in an old school sort of way. It'll give you a few bubbles if you're shooting against point light sources, and it has a kind of nice feel. It's a well-made lens, it's all steel and brass, and it's very easy to service should it need a bit of cleaning and lubrication. I've got a real soft spot for this lens. It's very old, very simple, and I love the images it makes. Prices for these have risen recently, but you can still pick up a good one for between £30 to £60 or thereabouts. Next up we've got the Jupiter 8, probably one of the most common lenses in the world, and for the price, one of the best. These things were made in the millions. It's an exact copy of the 1930s Zeiss sonar, and it was made by KMZ from the late 40s to about the mid-90s, and it makes some stunning images. The earliest versions used Zeiss glass, but these are very expensive now, even if you can find one. The more common versions using Russian glass date from the mid-50s onwards, and they're all very affordable, costing from around £30 to around £50. Apertures run from f2 to f22, so it's a fairly fast lens, and as it's a rangefinder lens, the minimum focus distance is 3 feet or 1 metre. It's a well-made all-metal lens. The body is aluminium, so it's light, but it does scratch quite easily. There are silver and black versions with a focusing tab, versions without, but differences in body aside, they're all essentially the same thing. Some 50s lenses have a Cyrillic letter P on the front plate, and these are often thought to be better, but that only denotes that the lens is coated, which all subsequent versions were, so don't pay more for a red P one because it doesn't really confer any advantage. I think this is a very cool looking lens, especially in the later black paint versions. There's just something right about it. The proportions seem just right. The lens sits nicely on the camera. It's a lovely little thing. The bokeh from this lens can be a little busy, but most of the time it's very nice indeed, very soft and creamy, with loads of lovely bubbles from point light sources. It makes a great portrait lens too. It can be a little soft wide open, but not outrageously so. I always shoot it wide open and find it entirely sharp enough. It sharpens up if you stop down to f8 or so, but that's not what this lens is about. Sharpness doesn't necessarily create a nicer or better image. What counts is the feel of the image, and this lens has as much feel as you want. It's a fairly low contrast lens, and it usually needs a hood if there's a light source in the frame, unless that's the look you're going for, and it has a stepless aperture so you can change settings on the fly. You'll sometimes hear that quality declined over the production run, but in my experience that just isn't true. The black body versions from the end of the production run are at least as good, if not better, than the 1950s versions. I love this little lens and I use it a lot. Like all rangefinder lenses, it won't focus much closer than 3 feet, but work around that, and it's an absolute gem. Definitely one not to be overlooked. Next up we've got the Industar 61. This was supplied as original equipment with VIII and VIII cameras, and it's a beautiful little lens. Maximum aperture's f2.8, so it's not that fast, but my goodness is this lens sharp. It's actually incredible. And the great strength of this lens is its price. It's so cheap. These lenses, again made by the millions, can be found anywhere from £10 to £20. They're practically free. It's an incredible bargain. It's not particularly fast at f2.8, but I've always found it fast enough. It will give you some nice bokeh. The bokeh in the distance is very, very smooth, very, very gentle, and it will give you some nice bubbles from point light sources. It does lose contrast like most of the Russian lenses if you shoot into the light, so best use a hood with this one if you want to make the most of its contrast, which in the right circumstances is actually quite strong. The very latest versions of the lens as supplied on the VIII are known as the Industar 61 LD, and that means that a mildly radioactive element, lanthanum, was used in the glass. It's very, very mildly radioactive, so it's really nothing to be worried about. Some will say that the version you're looking at now, which isn't the latest version, doesn't have this radioactive element, but in fact in the instruction manual for the VIII, it does say that it has this composition in its glass. So there wasn't really a change between the penultimate and the final versions. It's just that the final versions have LD marked on the front plate. The aperture has click stops, so if you want to change your aperture setting on the fly, if you're doing video for example, then this lens may not be ideal. However, the number of times I've had to change aperture on the fly while shooting video is very, very small, and in practice I don't think it makes a difference. I do think this is a great lens for video and for stills. It's a Tessar design, and that certainly shows in the images it makes. Very, very sharp, very good contrast, and very nice soft background blur. It's easy to service should that be necessary, and all in all, this lens is one of the best bargains in vintage lenses that you will ever see. They are absolutely fantastic. Snap one up now and use it. Here's another Russian collapsible 50mm. This is the Industar 22. It's a Tessar design, as many of the Industar lenses were, and again it owes its lineage to that original VIII, which was itself a copy of the Leitz Elmar. So it gives very, very pleasing images indeed. This is not a fast lens. This has a maximum aperture of f3.5 and minimum is f16, so you're not going to get too much in the way of blurry background, although it will give you some nice soft blur when it's fully open. If you care for your sensor, you will not collapse this lens on a digital body because it's just too long. It will hit the sensor and it will cause major damage. So a good idea is to just wrap an elastic band around the barrel just to prevent it collapsing accidentally. But if you take that precaution, you've got a very, very nice lens indeed. It's very well made. It's made from steel and brass, and it's very easy to service should it need relubrication or cleaning. It's coated, so it deals with light source in the frame much better than the VIII does, although we're talking about 1950s coatings here, so they're not as efficient as modern coatings, and this lens will lose contrast to some degree if you're shooting into a light source. The aperture's right on the front of the lens. It has a very small adjustment ring and it's very fiddly to adjust. Usually I don't bother adjusting, I just shoot fully open anyway. But if you do want to change aperture, it is a little bit fiddly, there's no doubt about it. It's a very cool looking lens. It has a mechanical sort of look. It has a very old school look, almost a steampunk sort of look. And I do often get asked what sort of lens it is when I'm out shooting with it. Colour rendition is really nice, and I would rate it equal to a modern in that respect. Prices for this lens have risen fairly recently. A good one of these will cost you anywhere between £40 to £60. So they're not the cheapest of the Russian lenses, but if you get one, it's money well spent. This is a fantastic lens. It's very hard to fault. It's a lovely little piece of kit. And finally, last but not least, is the ugly duckling of the Russian lens world. That's the Solidin Star 50. This was made in a collapsible mount, and I must say, if you want a better looking version than this one, the collapsible's the one to go for. However, this one, despite its unfortunate aesthetic appearance, at least in my eyes, is an absolute cracker of a lens. It's not a fast lens, its maximum aperture is f3.5, but this lens has two great strengths, and those are its sharpness and its colour rendition. In both those areas, this lens excels. My goodness, this is a sharp lens. I think it's sharper even than the Industar 61, and the colours it makes are really stunning. It handles colours really nicely, one of the best lenses I've found in this regard. It has an aluminium body and the focusing helix is made of brass, so it's again a very well made lens and it will last. It's very easy to service should you need to lubricate or clean it. And as far as price goes, this lens is one of the cheapest lenses in existence. It would appear that nobody wants this lens. Nobody, that is, except those who know how good it is. This lens is an absolute bargain. You can find a good one of these for between £5 to £15, and I've seen them go even cheaper than that on internet auctions. For the price, you cannot beat this lens. It is absolutely fantastic. It must be the best value lens in the world. Sure, it's not very fast, you won't get too much in the way of blurry background, but what blur there is has a nice quality. It's smooth, it will give you a few bubbles. It makes really nice images. This lens is an unsung gem, and if you're looking for an unusual, cheap, available lens that you can use on digital mirrorless, get one of these. You will not go wrong. So there we are, 5 fantastic Russian rangefinder lenses that you can buy today and use on a digital mirrorless body. They'll give you a fantastic look, they'll give you an old school feel. None of them focus closer than 3 feet, but that fact alone goes a long way towards helping you make images that have a certain feel, a certain flavour. If you think back to the days of rangefinders, the 40s and the 50s, when they were very popular, no photograph ever went closer than 3 feet. That's part of the old school look, and these lenses will give it to you. I can't speak highly enough of these lenses. There is not one dud among them. They are some of the nicest lenses you can buy. So, that's it from me for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you found it useful. Please do like and subscribe and hit the bell. The more people who watch the channel, the easier it is for me to keep on making and producing these videos. As ever, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time for more Zenography.